Let me ask you something. What is the relationship between teaching and learning? Does teaching cause learning, or is it more complicated? Of course, we want to educate medical trainees in the best way possible, but what is the purpose of education? Welcome to the podcast in which we question everything about medical education. Today we discuss the second installment in our series on philosophy and medical education that appears in the journal Teaching and Learning in Medicine. In the last episode, we discussed how philosophy can be valuable for medical education by asking fundamental questions about basic concepts that we use every day in our work and our research. In the journal Teaching and Learning in Medicine, what could be more fundamental than to ask about teaching and learning in medicine? The title of the article we discussed today is Beyond the Medical Model, Thinking Differently About Medical Education and Medical Education Research by Gert Biesta and Marije van Braak. You can read it on the journal website and I'll link it in the description. It's open access. So Marije and Gert write that in medical education, teaching is currently viewed as an intervention that causes learning. The task of medical education research is seen as establishing which educational interventions produce the desired learning outcomes. This medical model of education does not do justice to the dynamics of education. Well, what does that mean, going beyond the medical model? To discuss this, let me introduce our guests and my co-host. Gert Biesta is Professor of Public Education at the Centre of Public Education and Pedagogy at the Maynooth University in Ireland, and Professorial Fellow in Educational Theory and Pedagogy at the Moray House School of Education of the University of Edinburgh. He also holds a position as Professor of Education at the University of Humanistic Studies in the Netherlands. So that's Ireland, Scotland, and the Netherlands. Which one are you in right now, Gert?
We live in Scotland, so I'm just outside of Edinburgh at home right now.
And can you tell us a little bit about how you developed your ideas around education?
I've been interested in education from a very early age. So I used to play school when I was a child, and I know other children who have done that as well. And I ended up in teaching at some point. So I have been educating for a long time. And then I encountered literature about education, research on education that didn't really make sense to me. It didn't speak to my own experiences. And I think out of that, I started to figure out how can we talk differently about education? How can we theorize it differently? So I have to say that I've benefited a lot from what I would say is really poor quality theorizing of education. And I've tried to develop alternatives that, make more sense to me and to some other people as well. So that's the short history behind it.
I didn't know about your philosophy of education very long. I probably should have known about it because you're highly influential in the Netherlands. But fortunately, Marije van Braak fixed that. She introduced me to the philosophy of Biesta. And Marije is an educational scientist and a PhD candidate at the Department of General Practice Training at Erasmus University Medical Center in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. I know this actually firsthand because I'm a co-promoter in her project. But Marije is in Gouda now in the Netherlands, right?
Yeah, sure.
And if you've ever eaten Dutch Gouda cheese, after this podcast, you'll be able to impress your friends with the correct pronunciation, right? So, Marije, what do you see as the main takeaway of your article for teachers?
Well, I think that the main takeaway is that teaching isn't so much related to learning as we sometimes suppose in medical education, that teaching causes learning. So teaching is very much about creating opportunities for learning without guaranteeing learning. And that has consequences for how you consider evidence. So evidence-based education, for example, how do you go about evidence, research results? How do you apply them to your own practice? And also has consequences for how you design your teaching and how you design your assessment. What about your curriculum? So all aspects of education, actually.
Yeah, I have to say that you explained this to me a while ago, and I really had to get used to the idea of that education is not so much about learning. And I'm not sure I understand it, but I'm sure after this podcast I will. So let me introduce my co-host, Janet Riddle, who is a research assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she works as Director of Faculty Development. Janet, thanks for being my co-host for this episode with all these Dutch people. And if we accidentally switch to Dutch, then please let us know.
I would be happy to do that.
And can you tell me what your interest in this article was and how it connects to your own practice as an educator and faculty developer?
Great, thank you. So just as a bit of background about me, I'm a general internist, a physician by training. Shortly after I finished my residency training program, I grew into a role as a faculty developer, and that is what I spend most of my time doing. And so you could consider me a teacher of teachers, and so this article speaks a great deal to me in that particular role. Now I am working in the Department of Medical Education, teaching and supervising graduate students, and so I see myself as a generalist educator. And of course, this article speaks also to that particular role about how we design and think about scholarly projects in health professions education. I've already tipped my hand to both of you, is I'm going to be framing some of my questions from that perspective as a faculty developer, because to me that makes some sense in terms of how I think of specific examples of the application of your argument. Now, what I should tell you is the primary faculty development activity that I'm thinking of is a longitudinal program that I conduct. So every year I recruit somewhere between 15 and 20 faculty members across multiple disciplines. The primary goal is that I have listed is that the participants will develop an awareness of themselves as teachers. We also introduce and allow them to practice a variety of instructional skills so that they can innovate in their teaching, or I'd like to think enhance their teaching effectiveness. Now, the final point that I should make is that within my department, we talk about health professions education because we have multi-professional groups rather than talking about medical education. So if I use that expression, it's really kind of synonymous with what you have written as medical education. So with that introduction about me, I'd like to start interviewing both of you about the article that you've written, which I found very interesting.
Okay.
And so I'd like to consider some of the elements of the argument that you've made. And I just want to jump right into the argument you're making about the purposes of education. So you wrote two things that were really interesting to me and caught my attention. One is that you wrote that the language of learning is not sufficiently precise as we currently use it, and that the question of purpose is the first question that needs to be addressed. Now, I'm going to list the domains or purposes of health professions education that you describe in the article, and if you feel like you need to define those a little bit, I'm going to let you do that. And these three domains are professional qualification, professional socialization, and professional subjectification. Now, I point out that we also use the language of competence, professional identity, and self-directed learning. And so, Gert, I want to start with asking you, why is the language that we are currently using not sufficiently precise?
Probably the point to start with is the word learning, which is very easy to use and it's all over the place. And in English, there is this phrase, teaching and learning. I've even made the joke, it looks like that has become one word. But when people say that their ambition as teachers is to make their students learn, and I also read an awful lot of papers that say we're looking at the impact of this on that on student learning, I never know what it is about. And that's the point about not precise enough. And the quick way to say that is to just look at a couple of examples of where we use the word learning. Like learning to ride a bike, learning that 2 and 2 equals 4, learning to be patient, learning that you're not good at something. Now, if you take those 4 examples, they all meaningfully speak about learning, but they speak about very different experiences, processes, domains. So that is partly what irritates me about this use of the word learning. That actually, as educators, when we say that, we are not precise enough of what we hope from our students. Even then, when you say, can we talk about competence and professional development and self-directed learning, there is the word learning again. So I would be curious again then to say, so what kind of learning? So there is that cluster that we may want to come back to. And you can't say the first question we always need to ask as educators is not should our students learn, but actually what is the learning about? And before that, what is the learning for? What do we expect from them? If you say learning is some kind of change, we need to figure out what kind of change we're after. And there these three words, qualification, socialization, subjectification, come in as sort of an attempt in a general way to begin to give some profile to what we are after as educators, where you say part of what we're after is that our students become qualified, that they can do things, knowledge and skills, competence. Part of what we're after is that they sort of find their way in a particular field or a particular practice. I would call that socialization. So they learn about the history, about the values, about the rules, about the structures. And then I think there is always the question, where does that leave each individual student in relation to all that? And that has something to do with this domain of subjectification. I'm not saying that this will always cover everything, but it's a helpful way to begin to open up this whole question of learning in more educational terms.
Great, thank you. I oftentimes say in my faculty development work when the participants are struggling with this, why aren't my learners learning what I'm teaching? As I point out that learning happens. And it's not necessarily always because of, sometimes it's in spite of us as teachers.
Yeah, so you can say learning happens all the time. On some definition that is true. We also learn all kinds of things we shouldn't learn. So we pick that up as well. What is odd is that, in a sense, we never know in the moment whether we are learning or not. So none of us knows right now whether we will learn anything from this conversation. Maybe tonight or tomorrow or a year from now, something happens that we connect back. So you can say, to use the word learning can only happen after the event, not in the event itself. For me, that's another reason why I don't call my students learners, because we can't decide that. And I never tell them that they should learn. I tell them that they should try or explore or work hard or focus. So there is something more slippery about this word.
That's really interesting, your observation that we can only know that we have learned after the fact. So that will give us something to ponder. Marije, I want to bring you into this conversation because I'm as a faculty developer, I'm still really interested in the language or the vocabulary that I introduce and expect my faculty development participants to use in our conversations. And so I'm interested in your thoughts about the advantages or disadvantages of using this language of qualification, socialization, and subjectification as I am teaching the teachers.
So do you mean you as a teacher or them as teachers being taught about teaching?
The second.
Okay.
The second.
Yeah. I think like what you do in faculty development is trying to stimulate development of teachers who are becoming teachers, are teachers, or whatever they, however they consider themselves. I think that the main advantage of using these three terms, socialization, qualification, and subjectification, is that it makes a what you're doing as a faculty developer in the faculty development program more precise and more detailed. In a faculty development program, you try to help teachers stimulate learning, which is how it's sometimes called. Then what do you do in faculty development? If you use the terms qualification, socialization, and subjectification, you can say, well, how can we contribute as teachers to qualification? How can we contribute to socialization? How can we contribute to subjectification? So I think it makes it more precise, because it also pointing to these three purposes. I think it also points to the different roles that teachers have. Like, for example, in the context that I study, which is general practitioners, facilitating sessions where general practitioners in training reflect or discuss experiences from practice. They aren't only teachers being experts, but they also are role models. They are like as expert members of a professional community. They're also role models. So it helps teachers to sort of realize these different aspects of learning, and this also helps them to realize the different aspects of teaching, I would say. So that's one thing, and I would say these sound like three separate domains, but they are also integrated. So maybe it's not sort of a disadvantage, but it's something to consider, that these domains need to be integrated too in the faculty development program. So there are not just three separate domains that can be addressed separately, like in three parts of a program, but they are related too.
Well, we are going to get to that with a specific example that I'd like you to help me think about. But before we get there, so here's the concern that I have working with these teachers in development, is that these ideas, these concepts of qualification, socialization, and subjectification are a very different vocabulary than they are hearing in the settings in which they work. And I have a bit of a concern. I want to teach them the most valuable concepts, and yet I also want to be sure that those valuable concepts really connect with the workplace that they participate in as teachers, and the vocabulary that they are hearing in that particular workplace. And I'm glad to see here that's stimulating a reaction on your part.
Yes, yeah. For me, this is a beautiful example, because you say I want to give them the best language, but I also want to give them a language that they encounter in the fields in which they work. So I would say that the first is your ambition at qualification, to equip them with really good concepts. Mm-hmm. But then you acknowledge that these concepts are not very common, because in the fields and the practices in which they work, there are very different concepts. So you also have a job to show that field and say, be aware, I think these are good concepts, but when you go back into the field, you'll hear very different concepts. So you can say that's where you do the socialization. And then it raises a question, what are your students going to do with that tension? Are they going to say lovely concepts, but it will adjust to what everyone talks about, although I now know it's nonsense? Or I'm going to change the vocabulary of this field? And you can say to encounter that question, that's the subjectification question, where they come in and need to figure out what I'm going to do here. So for me, it's a beautiful example of how you can use this.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
Distinctions, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, Marije, what's your thought about that?
I haven't seen it that way, but I really like it, and it's also in my experience something that really resonates with other people too. So, for example, I've talked about these three concepts with medical educators in my environment, and I think especially because medical students or residents are really learning to be part or trained to be part of some sort of profession. So that the distinction between qualification but also socialization, becoming part of a profession, it does resonate with what they do as students and residents, except that it's not the educational terms that they use. So I think the ideas are sort of very recognizable to many medical educators and also students, but they're just not used to using these terms to describe what's happening when people teach and people participate in education.
I really like your question, Janet, and where it's coming from, because I think the experience of teachers is often that at every conference or with every article, it introduces some new concepts like transformative learning or performance or whatever. And I think these are really the kind of conversations that should happen more about, okay, but I already have so many terms and concepts and ways of speaking about it. And is this article introducing in this case, is this something really worth embracing, because, or is it just another language for something which I already know? What's your conclusion so far? Do you think you could use this in your own practice?
I have already shared the ideas of this article with the person who I facilitate the faculty development program with. So I suppose that already answers that question. How we choose to expand on the vocabulary that we're using, the vocabulary that we're modeling, remains to be seen. But I've already put that idea out there.
Oh, great.
Nice. It also connects to what you said, that your ambition is for your students to develop an awareness of themselves as teachers. And awareness needs language. And with different language, you can become aware of different facets. So for me, it connects very closely.
Well, thank you.
And I would say, if any of your students speak German, in German there are three words that are much more common in the German vocabulary than in English. So that's also behind it. But other languages, these distinctions are more everyday.
There may be. I don't know that yet about this particular group.
Okay, well, you can
I will
impress them by talking about Ausbildung, Bildung, and Erziehung. Who knows?
Fantastic. So I'd like to bring up something that I found really fascinating. You write that these domains suggest a framework for the development of curricula, that is, the content and experiences that our learners should encounter and work with during their professional education. And so you give several examples of these clinical experiences. I'll list a couple of them. So encountering the limits of medical treatment, the first unexpected patient death, uncertainty in treatment decisions, and resistance to one's medical decisions by either patients or colleagues. So I looked at this list as I was reading it, and I said, these sound like some of these really messy problems of professional practice that lack well-defined solutions. There's not one best answer to any of these situations. And so, Marije, I want to start with your thoughts on this question. So why are these types of problems or experiences the preferred problems or experiences for development across these three domains of qualification, socialization, and subjectification?
Well, I think they're sort of the example to show that education isn't straightforward. Education is messy, teaching is messy, and learning. Well, I'm not going to say anything about learning. So I think these experiences really show how qualification, socialization, and subjectification happen in practice. They're integrated in these types of complex, dynamic, messy, open situations which we can't really describe in simplistic terms, but we really need to explore and try to understand. So I think these are the perfect examples to show how there is an interplay between qualification, socialization, and subjectification. So that's why they're there.
So to deal with those situations, you obviously need knowledge and skills, because that's the difference between someone who encounters those situations without any knowledge and the people who do. You also need your way around in the whole field. So you can say there are qualification and socialization. But what's interesting about these examples is that they do not perfectly fit the knowledge and skills you have. They do not perfectly fit all, the way the field is organized and the way you know your way around. So you encounter a situation where you as an individual need to do something. And there you can say this dimension of subjectification comes in again. What are you going to do with all your knowledge, skills, your understanding of everything that's going on, knowing that this situation in some way is not the perfect fit with all that. So that's why we mention these examples, because they bring all this into play and actually put the educated professional himself or herself at the heart of that situation.
So we shouldn't be afraid of these, Marije, as you've characterized them, complex, dynamic, messy, open problems. We should use them strategically in our curricula.
Yeah, sure.
So I want to now move on to the second part of your argument, in which you're considering the dynamics of teaching and learning. Both of you write that education is a system that is open, semiotic, and recursive. In order to make these concepts perhaps a little bit more concrete for some of our listeners and readers, I'd like to consider an example from my faculty development work. So one of the topics that we will talk about is teaching in small groups. And the small group settings that I'm thinking about could be problem-based learning. They could be aspects of team-based learning. They could be aspects of the reflection groups that you talked about, Marije.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm looking for some insight on these types of small groups. To what extent are they open, semiotic, and recursive?
Open, semiotic, and recursive, it sounds quite theoretical, but I think it's quite easy or quite everyday. Open means that educational situations don't have very closed boundaries. So I assume that when you work with your students, they are allowed to leave after the session. You don't keep them for 24 hours in a room. So that's good news. That means they are open. So for that time, you are in an interaction, but once they leave, they can go on the internet, read a newspaper, encounter other people. So there are all kinds of other influences surrounding. That makes education open. Semiotic means that we are not working with physical forces, but with language. So you try to explain something, your students try to make sense of that, you give them exercises, you talk through things. That means that the dynamics are semiotic. And again, you can say, maybe as a teacher, you know perfectly what you want to say. That doesn't mean that that's also how your students understand it. So a lot of the work is going back and forth and working on interpretations. And recursive it's a technical term. It means a system that feeds back into itself. But in practice and education, it means that our students are not just objects that we influence, but they are constantly thinking. So you say something, they think about it, they ask a question. So you have a process that constantly sort of loops back into itself. And that you can say those three qualities make education a process that's quite difficult to control. And you can say that's the challenge to this idea of teaching causes learning. That's simply not how that situation works. Nonetheless, we do know that education works, that it does make a difference what we do. And when you begin to look at how do we try to make a difference as teachers, you can say, well, we do that partly by reducing openness. So we say, yeah, we're together in this room for the next 4 hours. And before that and after that, you're free, but for the 4 hours, let's work together. That begins to bring some focus into it. Assessment is a good example of testing understandings and saying, now give back to me how you have understood. We do that in the session or after the session. And then we also try to make our students, in your case, think not in any way, to think as teachers, for example, or to think as medical professionals. That's sort of bringing focus in the recursivity. So for me, this is a much better way to understand what we're doing there and how that works than simply to say teaching is the intervention and learning is the outcome, and let's make that tighter or more effective.
There was one point in my career when I loved to collect books that were had some part of their title being teaching tips. And I realized after I'd bought more of those books than I have ever read that there was something more to teaching than just applying a tip to a problem. And perhaps you have just described that. So Marije, help me understand how I might work with my faculty, my teachers, around this task or problem of small group teaching to make that educational system work in a more predictable way. So what advice do you have for me?
I think in some ways it's very straightforward, reducing what you're talking about, what the content is, how are we approaching some subject, what are the perspectives that we take. So it may sound quite complex, but in some ways it's very intuitive the way you design your education. You always have a topic that you want to talk about. You always have some direction that you want your students, something you want to achieve or to seek to achieve with your students. So that's one of the ways that you can do that. And also, I think, and that's more of a general educational principle, maybe, if you want to say so, but whatever you do is directed at some aim. That's what you learn as a teacher. So there's no way you can't reduce the openness, or there's no way you can't. In my head, it's more like we are reducing this openness, this complex system by what we do, regardless of what we do as a teacher.
Can I ask you the same question in reverse, Marije? Because sometimes the problem is that it's you want predictability. Sometimes the problem, as in I know from your study, you want to open things up. You want students to reflect. So do you also have advice if you think it's too close and you want to open things up, how to do that in small groups?
Well, what I see teachers try is just say, you can discuss anything you want. That's not the way it works, because people need some structure or need some example subjects or example situations to talk about. I think it's very much about, maybe it's more like a meta process of teaching students to explore different aspects than they are used to think about, for example. So asking the right questions, triggering them to go down a path that they wouldn't go down when they would be reflecting, if they are reflecting on their own. So I think it might even be more difficult to open up instead of reduce the complexities.
It's an important point you make, Marije, to when you just say, well, do what you want to do, then it's not education.
No.
So the real question is, if they're all looking to the left, how can you make them look to the right? Mm-hmm. So it's these little triggers as well. There's a beautiful phrase coming out of complexity theory, which is partly behind this. It's the idea of enabling constraints. So we tend to think constraints are limiting, but actually what we can do in teaching is put in some constraints, like saying, here's a problem and within 60 minutes you need to have a solution. Well, then you create energy and focus. So working with enabling constraints, sometimes to open up things or to say, I have no idea what the good answer here is. And what I did in a program I actually ran at the university to open up things is to completely take out assessment. And that's wonderful because it showed how students and tutors have become addicted to assessment. And when you say to students, there is no assessment at the end, I'm not going to tell you whether what you've done is of a sufficient standard. On one hand, it creates disorientation. Then suddenly students begin to realize, wait, I'm not here to please the teacher. I'm here to figure out myself what I need to do here and define quality.
I also have an example of that, if I may, because I teach third-year residents who are training to be general practitioners about how to teach. And we do have an assessment, a portfolio, and it's very ill-defined what should be in this portfolio. And literally every session I teach, we get the question, so how do I show that I'm a good teacher? Or what should be in this portfolio? And we keep saying, well, it's your task to decide how you can show us that you can do design, that you can do delivery, that you can do assessment. And so it's really something that, yeah, it's very difficult to deal with. Also as teachers, I think, because as a teacher, I also think it's quite difficult to just leave it open and see what comes your way.
I'd now like to turn to the broader argument that you're making about, maybe I'm overstating it, of that there isn't a causal relationship between teaching and learning. And I'm really interested in the vocabulary that we use, the terminology that we use as teachers or practitioners of health professions education with respect to research findings. And so I ask this question, to what extent should we even be using the language of quote unquote evidence-based teaching practices?
Well, there are a couple of arguments. There is a beautiful paper by a colleague of mine here in Britain, Andrew Davis. And the title is, It Worked There, Will It Work Here? And you can say that's the whole point. So all this research is fantastic because it always examines a very specific local situation with very specific conditions, and then something is possible. Well, that's great to know, but we shouldn't say that has proven that it will always work in all situations. That is the mistaken jump. So that for me is the first argument, that it's always interesting to know what happened in particular situations, but it cannot be a guarantee that it will work in other situations. And once we begin to think that that's the case, and a lot of this research is sold with this promise, just do this because it has the highest effect size or the highest impact, that is I would say, selling a lie to thoughtful professionals. And some people then say, this is my second point, that the problem is this word based. So we shouldn't be used the word evidence-based, but we should talk about evidence-informed. And I then go back and say, no, the problem is the word evidence, because in an awful lot of how the word evidence is being used, you find this idea of teaching as an intervention that causes some kind of outcome. And I think it's there that it already goes wrong. And whether you say you should base your practice on it or inform your practice about it, if you don't unpack what is in this evidence itself, what kind of idea of how education works, then the based and informed is actually an immaterial difference. So that's where I would start having this conversation.
Thank you. Marije, what's your perspective on our use of this phrase evidence-based or evidence-informed teaching practices?
Well, I think it's very natural to use evidence in the medical context. When I first started working at the general practitioner department, I asked, or one of my supervisors asked, what do you think is the most important word in medical research? So I didn't know, but he said, well, it's evidence. So so for the medical research, for the medical well, the way medical evidence-based medicine is used in medical practice. So, and I think that's really how it's used in evidence-based education in medical context too. But there is a discussion about evidence-based medicine being, you don't have to follow evidence to the, how do you say that, to the letter, but you have to use it to inform it. So this is actually the same discussion that that Gert just talked about. I think it's a very sort of luring us into this evidence-based teaching because we use this word in medical context, but it's not very productive, I would say, in educational context. It's, yeah, just like we were saying, because of the complexity, the openness of the teaching. So teaching has lots of local contingencies which aren't captured in RCTs and evidence. They don't fit every situation.
So Marije, in the grant proposal for your project, we wrote that your project is going to make this small group learning from experience evidence-based.
Mm-hmm.
And do we have a problem now?
You don't necessarily have to answer that question.
You might cut it out.
We view that as rhetorical, right? So Marije, there is another expression that I was reminded of when I saw an email from a colleague of mine. And so there have been there's a little bit of popularity right now, I think, in books that claim that they're going to teach. The books are going to inform us about teaching practices that are informed by the neurosciences of learning. To what extent is that teaching practices informed by the neurosciences of learning similarly a problematic phrase? Or is it not a problematic phrase?
Well, I would say it really connects teaching to what's happening in the head. So it sort of uses cognitive evidence to make an argument for one teacher strategy or another. It might teach us something. It might give us some information that would be relevant in some situation. But what we really need to know is what's happening when teaching when people teach. And I don't think that's something that you can. Personally, I wouldn't be interested in what happens in the head, because that's something that might not even be happening the moment you teach. So what are you measuring when you measure cognitive processes, neuroscientific processes? Are you measuring learning? And even if you're measuring learning, are you measuring learning at the right point in time? People can learn or see the light, like we just discussed at the beginning of this episode, way later than the teaching moment. So to me, it doesn't really make sense to do neuroscientific research, probably because I see teaching and also learning as an interactional process, and not so much as a cognitive process.
Gert, do you want to add some comments?
Yeah, a little.
Did I pick something that might be a little a bird under the saddle blanket, so to speak?
You phrase it very nicely. I think you said something like there is a bit of enthusiasm for this. In some circles, people think this is the only thing we should be doing. So one concern I have is actually, what does the word learning mean here? And I don't think learning exists in a general sense. So when you begin to open up that, what you often see is that learning is defined as a process of intelligent adaptation to an environment. The learning sciences, they say we study intelligent adaptive systems. And yeah, I've written a paper about that where I say, well, what's a good example of an intelligent adaptive system? That's a robot vacuum cleaner. Because these are systems and they adapt to the environment. So the first time they hoover your room, they bump into things. The next time they move around it very smooth. So if that is the paradigm for learning, also coming out of neuroscience, you can then ask, is that what we want in education? And you can say, there is a lot about education that maybe fits this idea of intelligent adaptation. But there is one thing that a robot vacuum cleaner can never do. The robot vacuum cleaner cannot say no. It cannot say, I don't want to clean the office of Adolf Hitler. And there, a human dimension comes in that is missing in this way of theorizing. So that for me is the biggest concern, that it speaks about a particular model of human action that actually doesn't reach what is absolutely crucial, that we're not just organisms that can adapt cleverly, but that we can also say no at some point and say this goes too far. Like in medical situations where we say this is really silly to continue with this treatment because the patient is suffering from it. So that's my strong response to this enthusiasm about the reduction to neuroscience.
I think this is a really interesting discussion because it touches on many of the points that we'll be addressing later in the series. Some of the articles which are now under review, like what is evidence? What we need we cannot just do anything we feel like in education. We need a kind of system. We need a kind of direction. But then do we have something outside of us telling us what it is? Do we have like a rule book or a guidance? And then the response of there's neuroscience, but there's also the cognitive psychology about let's understand let's measure the emotions and the learning that occurs within the student. And what I really like about your article is that it connects to something that I've been thinking about, especially in the context of the book of Matthew Crawford that's called The World Beyond Your Head. So that title already expresses that. And there he talks a lot about, I guess he calls it individuation, but it could maybe be translated to subjectification. And he talks about attentional environments. And the idea of attention and guiding attention seems very relevant there. And so in this podcast, we have a long-standing tradition that I quote Hannah Arendt at least one time in every episode. So I just read this. I didn't know this when I read it on Twitter. She writes that the mere reading of a book requires some degree of isolation, of being protected against the presence of others, which of course relates to what you write in the article about reducing openness and the interference of the outside by putting students in classrooms. So I wonder if either of you, if you could, because for me it's an open question. I'm thinking about, is education about attention? Like Gert, you said before, you don't tell your students that they must learn, but what if you would tell them, okay, I don't ask you to learn, I ask you to study, because the word study comes from paying attention to something, I think.
Yeah. So I would say, and I have said, that I think attention is a much better way to think about what we do in education. And studying is a good word for that, because that is about, focusing attention, paying attention. And I think what I do with my own students is much more giving them tasks and challenging them to pay attention. And I leave it sometimes just to them to see what they do with that. So not even to say you have to learn something from it. Just to stay with the situation can already be a really important educational experience. To stay with something that you don't understand and probably will never understand, like the mystery of life and death. We have no real understanding of what goes on there. To stay with that and to pay attention to that is, quite something.
So, Gert, when you were talking about that of sitting with something, staying with something, it struck me as one of the important messages of most meditation practices. And I thought, well, isn't that what I'm trying to do with my faculty in faculty development? Is just sit with something. You don't need the answer today. You don't need the answer tomorrow. But sit with it, reflect on it, pay attention to it.
Yeah. So again, coming back to where you started by saying I want my students to develop an awareness of themselves as teachers. Well, that's for me precisely this process, because there is a difference between experiencing something or seeing something or thinking that you see something. So to be aware of something rather than that you already think that you know it, that's part of the educational process as well. To say, oh, I think it's this, and you say, no, it's not that. We'll take that away. We'll take that away. How close can you then get to that? And for me, that's quite educational. And here is a lovely author. It's a German author who says, education is the work of the hand. So he says it all starts with the work of the finger, where we say to our students, well, pay attention to that. Or, as I said, you're looking to the left. Let's for a moment look to the right. And all these are processes of attention formation. Sometimes we say to our students, and I really hope that you will take this and this from it. And sometimes we just say, I really hope that you stay with that. But you have to take from it what you will take from it. That's the spectrum. If you need to teach people how to, fly a Boeing 777, it has to be pretty precise in terms of your outcomes. But all good professionals, at the end of the day, have to be prepared for these messy, unpredictable, never completely fitting real-life situations.
We're getting very philosophical here. But again, that's the point.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the implications of your argument for us as health professional, educator, teachers, practitioners. I want to now consider the implications of your argument for the research that we do. What are the elements of an educational ecology that I should be or might be studying in faculty development, in the teaching of teachers?
I would partly go back to these three dimensions of educational systems to study what do we do with openness and closeness. And these are subtle processes. So we cannot even say here's where we put the limits, because that's constantly moving. So that requires quite nuanced study. The same with the whole process of meaning making that goes on, the semiosis, because that's part of the dynamics of what constitutes a particular educational ecology. And then the recursivity. How do people think? How do they make judgment about what they do next? What does a student do in coming up with a question they ask the tutor, a question they not dare to ask the tutor? So when you begin to get a the sense of all that, which is very complex, then I think you begin to understand what makes a particular session tick and other sessions do not really tick. And that, I think, ultimately gives much more thoughtfulness to what teachers can do than just to say, here are the 5 things with the highest effect size.
So what I do is I do interactional research. So I focus on particular interactional dilemmas that teachers have in facilitating collaborative reflection between general practitioners in training. So, for example, they may struggle with jumping in. So when do I take a turn? When do I bring in my expertise? Or do I just leave the process be and see what happens? So, and these, I have several of these dilemmas, which I try to pinpoint in interaction. So where I see people jumping in, for example, teachers contributing to a discussion, but also similar moments where they don't. So, and I try to compare these and see what happens. Really very descriptive. And then I take some of these very typical or telling examples to teachers, and I show them just line by line what happens, without saying, well, this is a good way of dealing with the situation, or this is a way that isn't very productive. I just show them what happens, and that's already enough to get some discussion going and to have them think about, okay, what would I want to do? So I just play the situation, as it were, and stop it after every new person starts a turn. And I can ask them, so what would you do? What would someone else do? And we can discuss their strategies. So it's sort of is based on what really happened.
It's a very good example of you do it in a thorough way. So very little steps, attention to detail, but also thoughtful, because you're trying to do justice to what's really happening,
yeah,
rather than to sort of put a model over it and say we can abstract from it. And if you do that, then there is a 74% chance that the student will respond in that way. Then you're no longer in the situation.
Yeah. And in my experience, that's what teachers start asking me at the start of these sessions. So what do we need to do? What works and what doesn't work? And I always have to disappoint them, because I just can't say what works and what doesn't work, but still they get some ideas to think about it, to use in their own practice.
So that's very interesting. What you're doing is really very grounded in the participants' lived experience. But if you call this experience-based something or the other, then that would really go counter to the current trend in medical research, which is we don't practice experience-based medicine, and yet experience is really crucial when it comes to how we make choices in medical practice. So perhaps one of the dimensions of educational ecology is the use of educational judgment on the part of the teacher.
Yes. And there I would say, and then I'll stop, judgment is first of all a matter of perception, ability to see a situation as this or that, or in terms of this or that. And that goes back again to attention. How can you read a situation in terms of its educational potential, for example?
I think that's a great place to end the discussion, because some of the topics that we discussed, they will be explored in much more depth in the rest of the series. So we have an installment about evidence-based coming up. What is evidence, and how do you relate that to evidence from your own experience? We have an issue about language. You even said that education is mainly semiotic or linguistic, which is a whole interesting topic to explore in itself. And we're going to speak about the role of what the authors call aesthetic experience. So that's really also in medical practice, Janet. What is the role of your own more intuitive understanding of the situation in relation to what we know from statistics and research, which is obviously very important as well. So thank you, Janet, thank you, Marije, and thank you, Gert. And thank you for listening. And next time I have some more questions for you.